that I know
Well,
of.
you haven't tested positive for
I've
COVID.
never tested positive for COVID. I don't
I
know
guess-
how. I don't know.
Yeah,
Why.
after RSA, it seems like you were in
Right?
contact with like so many people.
Yeah. Like I was sick after well, it wasn't right after RSA. I got sick like after I went to San Diego. But
Sorry.
yeah, it's no fun.
No, in the wintertime, it's like you almost expect to have a cold, and it's just like that cozy,
Yeah, but like in July, like no one wants to be sick in July.
No, not at
Too
all. You
bad.
look out the window, it's like a beautiful day out, and you're just like blowing your nose.
Right.
All right, well, enough about that. Let's get started and talk about some Windows Event IDs. Thanks everyone for hopping on. Michael, yes, you will get a copy of the recording. We'll send that over to you afterwards. But feel free to continue to post any questions in the Q&A or the comments, and we will address them as we see them. All right, let me share my screen before we get started. And I apologize for my sniffling.
All right. I have to mute to cough, so
I'm fairly healthy, which is
that's
rare-
good.
It's a rare thing.
We like having healthy people.
Yes, for sure. All right. So, yes, today we're talking about what you need to know about Windows Event IDs. This is a resource that, as Amanda and Matt can tell you, can provide a lot of visibility into your Microsoft environment. But it's a little overwhelming to get into if you don't know exactly what you're looking at, and monitoring every single Windows Event ID that comes through is going to be a waste of your time and will surely create a lot of frustration on your end. So Matt and Amanda are going to go through some event IDs that are really important to monitor. They'll go through some tips on how you can use them to their fullest. So let's get started. Before I get started officially, my name's Erica Mixon. I'm the content manager here at Blumira, and I am joined by Matthew Warner, who is our CTO and co-founder at Blumira. Matt, thanks for joining.
Hi, happy to be here.
Yeah, happy to have you.
About Windows stuff.
Awesome. Matt is always joining us on webinars and providing some great information. So Matt, we're excited to have you on. And we've also got a very tired Amanda Berlin, who's I'm sure working hard creating all of our detections for our SIM. Amanda's our lead incident detection engineer here at Blumira and has pretty much written the book on Microsoft security. I mean, you have written a book.
I wrote a chapter on it.
There you go. A mini book.
The next one comes out soon, right? I feel like
Itself.
we should promote
We'll see. The next book should come out in October.
Yeah.
We'll just see, because there's supposed to be two of us writing it.
Well, Amanda, we're excited to have you on, and I know that you're going to provide a lot of great tips as someone who used to be an administrator with, hands on the keyboard, and now you're creating detection. So you've got a lot of great experience in this topic, and we're excited to hear from you with that.
Yeah.
Cool. So let us get started. Once again, just a reminder, feel free to post any questions in the chat or in the comments. We'll also be having some polls throughout, so stay tuned for those, and let's dig right into it. So what are Windows Event IDs? What sort of information can they tell you? Amanda, you want to delve into that a little bit?
Oh, so much stuff. So I'm sure most people on this call have at least seen Windows Event Viewer, right? Most people that have worked in IT, I think, have seen it. But it's come a very, very long way in a short time. So any of you that have worked in IT for a while, if you were, working on XP or earlier, Event Viewer really didn't show you a whole lot. It was, maybe failed logins, maybe some stuff with your software installs or whatever. But after it's around 2010, they actually really made Event Viewer, and the events that are going into it, much, much better. So you have the ability to look at almost everything that you want to know that comes along with the Windows operating system. It's just, trying to figure out what's important usually tends to be one of the hard parts.
Mm-hmm. what are some of the biggest frustrations that you've had around working with either Event Viewer or Windows IDs?
Event Viewer is just terrible to use. Like if you're looking for one thing in one specific portion of time, like if you're testing something, that's one thing. Like when I'm creating presentations on stuff and I want to throw an Event Viewer thing in there, you test the thing, you look in Event Viewer, you usually can tell where it's at, and that's fine. If you're using it to like actually investigate suspicious or malicious things, it can be very, very cumbersome to use because it's slow. Logs roll, and they don't stay on disk for forever, so you may only have hours, if not like minutes of information there. So there's a lot of reasons that people don't necessarily directly use Event Viewer to find things.
Sure. Yeah, I'll for myself, I'm even lazier than that. I just don't want to have to go to an individual machine to look at it.
Yeah, right.
And to be quite honest, I forget how to use it every time until I go back to using it, and then I have to remember how to use it again.
Right.
And getting to the right place within the right channel within the Event Viewer is just like it's infuriating.
Yes. Like try and find one thing in Event Viewer if you don't know what channel it's in is impossible.
Yes.
That's what some of our attendees are saying. It's slow and it has limited filtering and search options, and then PowerShell logs woes, having to find them in the PowerShell channel, security channel.
And then digging down into operational stuff. Yeah, for sure.
So
yeah. Someone actually just dropped in documentation is available. It's kind of available. It's it's one of those classic Microsoft pieces of technology where it never works the way you want it to. And while there is documentation, it is not good documentation. You will hate reading it, and you'll hate your experience while dealing with it. It's a miserable time, and I mean it doesn't help that for anyone who has been managing Windows since the XP days, that things changed wildly when they flipped over their event source from XP, the olden days, IM Vista, and over to the new version is. And that not only that, the event IDs changed at the same time for a lot of the different event IDs. So anyone who was forced into like classic implementation of researching Windows is now in a place where you still have to relearn more Windows stuff. And with many updates of Windows, and I know we saw a few more with Windows 11 2020. I'm sure we'll see more as there continue to be kernel updates. It's a fun game that Microsoft plays with all this.
So there are some security events that you can find with Windows Event IDs. What about on the operational side? We'll talk about this a little bit more later, but what are, what sort of information do Event IDs give you from that angle?
So one of my favorite parts of Windows Event IDs, which is the most insane thing to say, is that you can start to get some really deep driver level information. One of the ones that we really like to see are things like your smart drivers will report if disks are failing. Those get logged out to Event ID. That can be really helpful, especially with a remote workforce, or just if you're someone who has like 1,000 optiplexes and you're like, I don't know, at one point these are going to start failing. Those kind of events become really useful, being able to report on them. Similarly, if you are looking for additional, I think we're going to talk about this in a few slides, maybe. But if not, if you're looking for additional visibility into like what MSIs are being installed, what exists on these hosts, you can really get some detailed MSI installation details out of things like 1022 is a good one for that, where it's going to tell you like this MSI was installed by this user. And maybe you don't need that, and it's just an auditing thing of like, yeah, we know that these are the MSIs that were installed this month, but it can be really helpful to get that level of information. And both of those examples are also really good examples of the question that just came in, or statement that just came in, that's around how difficult it is to determine what these event IDs are. The only reason we and I know about the things like the disk failing and MSI installs and that kind of thing is because we've literally sat down and just gone through every single log in out of Windows servers. And there's ultimatewindowssecurity.com, which is one of the best repositories you will find for Windows Event IDs. I strongly recommend using it. And there's some other ones out there as well, of course, but you can get really good, interesting information that is inherently part of Windows if you want to dig into it. However, Event Viewer is hell on earth, and you will not get even the defined information. If I recall correctly, it's going to give you things like a user logged in with a hex version of the login type. So you're going to have to go and find out what that actually is. So and we'll talk about it a little more, but it's a whole kind of rat's nest as you dig further and further into it.
Thanks, Matt. Just a technical note on our end. It seems that chat isn't working for all of our attendees. I apologize for that. I think it might be an issue on Zoom's end. I can't see a fix here, but if you have any questions or comments, just feel free to use the Q&A because that seems to be working just fine.
Yeah, I can read out your statements.
All right, so we've talked about some of the frustrations around Windows Event IDs. It looks like a lot of you folks that that voted in the poll said that you don't know what to monitor. 50% of you said that. So let's get into some of the most important event IDs that you can monitor and why they're important, and we'll talk about each of those. All right, so event ID 4688, new process creation. Matt, why is this an important one to monitor in your mind?
So 4688 is not enabled by default. It's part of the advanced auditing, if I remember the exact GPO name of it, within Windows. And what this allows you to do is get detailed information around what your users are actually spawning. Well, users or applications are spawning within that application itself. Really most important, I'll let Amanda speak to the detection side because she's way better than I am at that kind of thing. But really what it allows you to do is get that process level information, whereas you likely will not be able to get that unless you have a really loud NGAV in place that's going to log all that out. And even if you do, 4688 enabling it within your advanced auditing in your GPO gives you this really nice granular level of secondary information outside of that NGAV. And it can be really helpful for identifying not only what your users are doing, which Amanda will go deeper into in a sec, but it also lets you get more visibility into what your other applications are doing, how the environment is working, what's spawning other processes. And that all becomes really important generally within that environment. Unrelated to security, but very related to security as well.
Yeah, I mean, before that advanced auditing was added to Windows, you had to rely on next gen antivirus. Like nothing else would tell you what parent process spawned Notepad, or you have a PowerShell command line running and opening up Chrome to download something. Like it doesn't. You never had that visibility before. And 4688 was the first way that they offered that in a log file. So like before any of that happened, you have absolutely no idea how you were compromised, right? You could not track anything down. But I mean, it's very loud. It's a very loud log because just think about all of the processes that are created anytime you do something on an endpoint. It's very noisy, but it can be really, really super useful. So like anytime you open up a command line and type something in there, it can log to 4688 if you have that turned on.
Do you want to talk a little bit about, is this the way that you do detection for like the Conti ransomware playbook for net user and that kind of thing as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we
go a
do.
Little deeper into that?
Yeah, so we do 4688 and Sysmon Event ID 1. So they're both kind of the same thing. Sysmon Event ID 1 gives you more information. So they give you like the hashes that you can go look up afterwards. And what else does it give you? Depending on your sysmon config, it can actually tie to TTPs and stuff like that. But yeah, so Conti, and then there's a couple other things that we know that have been seen in the wild as far as using like net user, net computer, just the command straight from the command line. Granted, like admins do that stuff too, but it's not super common, especially with the way that they do that for those specific types of attacks. And that's all found in those two event IDs. So, you could go and do, and honestly, if you talk to any attacker or pen tester or whatever, like that's one of the first things that they do when they get a command line on a box, right? They do net user, they want to see who's logged in. You can do net domain admins and see who's a member of the domain admin group. There's a bunch of different things that you can do that's also seen in those kind of attacks.
We've got a question on this one from an attendee. Should that audit be used over sysmon and its process create event ID, or should they both be used?
You can pick and choose. If you have sysmon, we always recommend having sysmon installed. And you don't necessarily even need 4688 if you have sysmon event ID 1.
Yeah, you can use it interchangeably, I think.
Right. But you have to, like, sysmon's a service that can be stopped. So as long as you know that sysmon's always working and always running, you can use sysmon event ID 1. But like if sysmon breaks, you'll always have 4688. That's not really like something that can just not happen anymore unless like the audit policy gets changed. Right. So it just depends on if you want to store both of them.
Right.
Very, very much so.
That's a good tip. And
another one, somebody asked how to enable. And I think I can put this in chat because chat is all messed up. So you enable it through the GPO for 4688. If you Google Blumira log Mira, I wish I could type this to everyone, but I can't.
It's on GitHub.
It's on GitHub. We have our own GPO templates that will enable this for you and get it up and going for you to get visibility into this. Otherwise, if you type in 4688 enable, and I wish I could link this to everyone, there's a Microsoft doc called Command Line Process Auditing. You scroll down a little bit, it'll give you the specific details you need in regard to which GPO. I'm going to say it out loud, not that anyone's going to remember this unless you're looking back. It's inside of the Windows settings, advanced audit configuration, detailed tracking. You just have to turn on audit process creation. Or our template, Log Mira on GitHub under Blumira will also get that turned on.
Yeah, there's also another one that you have to turn on for the command line part too. So like there's process event creation and then something else. There's two different things.
Yeah, and our template will get that up and going for you. So we do recommend using the template because it will get a lot of this advanced auditing up and going for you.
Yep. Created the template just because it was a pain in the butt to turn on everything every time. We created a new lab every other week.
Well, thanks for all your questions. Keep them rolling. Should we move on to the next event ID?
Sure.
Why not?
This is kind of a 2-for-1. We've got event IDs 4624 and 4625. So it seems like the pattern here is that most of these event IDs are not enabled by default. They're not always enabled by default.
There's a lot that's
yeah. So how do you deal with that? Is it kind of a matter of just like turning on the ones that you think work best for your organization, or just kind of going through all of them? I imagine would probably be pretty unwieldy.
Yeah, so that log Mira kind of turns on everything that we have relegated to be useful for detections. There's also an original article and website by Miller Archaeology that has like a whole bunch of different like PDFs and stuff of like best practice logging. So they have like best practice Windows and Linux and like all of this kind of stuff, which is super great. We just took that and added some more stuff to it and turned it into a template. So you don't have to just go through one by one and turn on everything manually. And 4625 is just one of those events that everyone just assumes Windows is going to log, and they wonder why they can't detect on password spraying. So you're never going to detect on brute forcing or password spraying or anything if you don't have 4625 enabled, because it's only going to look for the successful logins.
For sure.
Can you tell us a little bit about how Blumera detects password spraying?
Not just these event IDs. I think we might have another slide. Yeah, I think this one and this one and the next one that we use for password spraying and brute force detections. So there's a handful of different ways to do it, right? Because there's a difference between password spraying and brute forcing and what's the other one? Credential stuffing. The difference between all three of those. So like you can have your one account being tried with like thousands of passwords. You can have a bunch of different accounts being used with one password. You can have a password list being used against different things. So yeah, we have a kind of like this one-to-many logic that we use over a certain amount of time. So that's not something that you can detect on like automatically in a single point in time, because password spraying and all of those things happen over like, I don't know, anywhere from 5 to 30 minutes, depending on like sample size. But yeah, you can definitely see it happening. If you look in the event logs, you can see, you know, 1,000,04625 logs in the security channel. So it's not I mean, depending on the language you're writing detections in, it can be weird logic, but I mean it works. And then there's yeah, what's some of the other, I guess those are all, there's other ones related to like cloud password spraying and stuff like that, but those are not necessarily event IDs. I'm thinking about.
Yep.
And what about these Kerberos event IDs here, 46, 4768, 4769, 4771? How do these relate to the previous ones that you were talking about? Matt, do you want to talk?
Yeah, sure. So what we often see, generally speaking, which is by no means the guaranteed rule, is organizations will be classic NTLM. They've built NTLMs that they're used to doing. And then they've gotten enough pen tests, or they get a really bad pen test that says you need to shut off NTLM. Responder was used to basically destroy this environment. We need to figure out how to move to Kerberos. And the moment that you move to Kerberos from an NTLM environment and shut off NTLM, you can very quickly lose all visibility into authentication and ticket requests within that environment. And it's really important if you're the kind of, if you weren't set up for Kerberos by default, like you built it into your DC as a part of the forest and the tree. And in those situations, it becomes really important to review your logging and auditing as you're making those changes to make yourself more secure, to also ensure that you have the same level of visibility in your environment from the Kerberos perspective. It's way more secure than NTLM. You can't do as much bad stuff, which is great. So it's always a good move to Kerberos for authentication. However, you need to make sure you enable these as a part of your visibility, which is part of the GPOs for Kerberos, to make sure that you get this level of visibility. So pre-authentication failed, ticket requests, ticket granted, those, the three that you're seeing here, become really, really important event IDs if you are using Kerberos as your authentication. And to Amanda's point, you can get even wonkier when you have an environment that uses both, and you want to detect password spraying against both at the same time. And you really have to have visibility across both different types of authentication to ensure that you're really getting the information that you want out of that environment. You're seeing the ticket request, you're getting it out. And as you think about even more kind of complex pieces of Kerberos, it's really important, just for the sake of maintaining your environment and knowing what's happening, to have these turned on, because 4624 and 4625 are not going to work the same way if NTLM goes away. Actually came up this past week. If you're using Kerberos auth, 4624 and 4625 will no longer tell you the workstation name. It is removed from the log in 4625 if you are leveraging Kerberos as your authentication mechanism. Because Kerberos doesn't care about that information, doesn't pass it to the actual server that's doing that authentication. And it's one of those areas where I think a lot of organizations, for good reason, think that they're going to switch to Kerberos. They'll be more secure, they'll get more visibility, and you can very quickly lose a bunch of visibility while trying to figure out where you get to that next point. So it becomes really, really important to get that information out. And I'll let Amanda talk about the hunting accounts because that's a fun one.
Yeah, so I guess along the same event IDs, that's how. So I don't know if anybody knows about Kerberoasting and how that attack works, but you're basically using a feature of how Windows just works in its authentication mechanism and intercepting a ticket on its way back to you. So there isn't a way standardly that you can really tell that you're having that attack performed against you because it's just using the service, right? That's like it just blends in with all of your other authentication attempts. So what we've done, there's a way that you can do it with Honey accounts. There is a also on our GitHub, it's called Doge Mira, and it is a PowerShell script that will create 2 different Honey accounts that we can detect on. And one is for Kerberoasting and one is for AS rep roasting, because it's basically the same kind of thing. It's just where it's being intercepted and how for the attack. And it'll create those 2 accounts, and then that's what we end up triggering on. And it just looks like a I think it's an IIS service account that it ends up looking like. So it kind of blends in so an attacker doesn't like take that out of their list, right? Because you don't want a honeypot or Honey account to be like, this is definitely our Honey account. Please spray against this so we can detect you. So you want it to kind of blend in. So it's just like a random account name that blends in with other things.
These are all good tips. Thanks, Amanda. Let's move on to the next few event IDs that we have to cover. 104 and 1102. These are cleared event logs and cleared audit logs. So these could be an indication that an attacker is, clearing logs and trying to cover up their tracks. Is it always an indication of that?
I could take this one if you like.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So this is one that it's always a weird one because classically, you're always going to hear in the world of security and application. My house is about to get loud. There's about to be some dogs barking. What you often hear is if someone's clearing forensic data, you need to. This is really important. You know that's occurring. And that's very true. But what we classically see these days, and keep me honest on this one, Amanda, we almost never see attackers clear logs these days. It happens, don't get me wrong, and depending on who you are and how you're being targeted, it could definitely happen to you. But ransomware operators are not really concerned about the event log having data in it because they're going to encrypt your data anyways. At least that's their goal, of course. So it's not a huge concern for them. However, in the days of Emotet Trojans, if you're a target for a nation state, these are things you still need to be concerned about. They're still going to happen.
Sketchy admins.
Sketchy admins for sure. It's probably the biggest issue. And where we really most see it is that third bullet point. We see it happen most often. We obviously give people feedback whenever we see this, is they have a machine image, but they didn't clear the logs before they completed that gold image. So every time they deploy a new image, they also script out clearing those logs. And it results in a situation where you have this really loud VDI environment or just general environment where you're imaging machines, and you have a guaranteed very significant false positive every time you do it. So one of the things that we often push on, and I'm sure many of you have seen it on our webinar, we talked about this, probably heard me talk about it before, always check your images and make sure they're as clean as possible before you deploy them. So when this occurs, it's not well, it's probably just the VDI environment. Who cares? It's not a big deal. We'll move on to the next thing. You know, this should not have happened. What admin did this, or what user did this, and why did it occur? It's better if you can get it closer to like a domain admin, where it's a, yeah, I want to validate that this occurred, and less of a, oh, well, that's just a thing that happens. Because at one point, it happening will not be intentional. So it becomes really important to make sure you're getting proper fidelity on this kind of detection. And it's enabled by default on every version of Windows forever, as far as I know, which is also nice. And it's impossible to disable, which is also nice. You get a nice guaranteed detection. So that's it.
Very cool. Those are some good tips, Matt. Thank you. Amanda, do you have anything that you wanted to add on here?
No, that's pretty much it.
Cool.
Sorry.
Yeah,
me
no, it's
talking.
fine.
I don't stop. It's a problem. Yeah.
Love it, Matt. All right, let's keep it rolling.
It's an easy one to test.
It's super easy to test. Yes, for sure. Yes. I'll let you have this one, Amanda, because you love PowerShell.
Oh my gosh.
logging. It's your favorite.
I do. I do. I've spent countless hours creating detections for PowerShell. Yeah, so this is so it does say it correlates with 4688 on here. So in the beginning of creating the detections and everything, I wondered why, like, it just seemed really, really quiet as far as like things being run in PowerShell across all of our customer environments. And that's when I remembered like a lot of different commands that are run are actually done via the command line, and it just calls PowerShell, which if you do something via the command line, calling PowerShell and doing all this PowerShell stuff in the command line, it doesn't log in any of these. It logs in 4688. So then turning that on opened up a whole new can of worms, because then it ends up being really, really super loud, because there's, everybody does it that way instead of just in PowerShell. But if you open up PowerShell command line instead of just like the regular command line, it logs to these three event IDs. So you can kind of see the same thing. You can turn it on so it logs every different module in group policy, and that's another thing that we have added in there. And you can see a lot of really weird stuff. Like one of my favorite things is decoding encoded PowerShell commands, because you just end up seeing a lot of very interesting stuff happening in environments. So, ransomware actors, just random download, like drive-by downloads, all of that kind of stuff ends up encoding their stuff in encoding their PowerShell stuff, because it's harder to detect on what's actually being encoded. You can detect on encoded stuff all the time, but then you do end up getting not necessarily false positives, but they're not malicious stuff, right? They're not useful stuff. So I've seen like actual SCSI drivers software updating and using encoded PowerShell, which was weird. Like, I don't know why you would see that. But then like Cobalt Strike will encode their PowerShell commands and so they can run. So it's really useful. It's just, it ends up being one of those rabbit holes that you can look at. I mean, it gives you a whole lot of visibility into your environment, and you can like see some things that you didn't necessarily know were happening, which is pretty cool.
For sure. Yeah. I personally love, for myself, I love the ability to have the entire script forever. Like every script that's run, you can know what it is, which is great if you have the data volume to handle it. And it's great for incident response if something goes wrong. But yeah, it's one of those areas where to Amanda's point, when you decode that PowerShell, it could either be the hottest thing you've ever decoded and you're about to drop another Cobalt Strike beacon on your machine if you aren't careful, or it's a driver for a printer. So you get this really weird kind of dichotomy at this point across the how different organizations are leveraging PowerShell, and it's terrible. That's probably the best way to put it, because it's the when you're we kind of do this with Lumiere. I try not to do this when we deploy things. We have Posham to deploy for our own ability to collect data. We try not to do anything encoded, just because if you can avoid it as a company that doesn't perform offensive things, you're better off not doing it if at all possible, for the sake all blue team.
We've got a couple of questions, and thank you for that, Matt. Appreciate that. We've got a couple of questions around max log size. So we're wondering, what's the best practice for max size these days? How large do you set your logs to? A couple questions around those. So either of you want to take that on?
Yeah, so I was just pasting an answer to that one in the Q&A. So I think it sends the answers to everybody if you can see the answers, because I didn't click on send privately, so I'm going to send this in a second. You'll have the link. But before we had Poshum, which just automatically generates everything. We also actually, you know what, this is in Logmira. Never mind. The max log size is in Logmira, and right now it is set at max log size for application and system is around 16,000, and then security is like 2 million, and I think that's in bytes.
Yeah. So 16
like
megs and
2 gig.
gigs.
Yeah, 16 meg and 2 gig. And that, I mean, anymore with how cheap data storage is, you don't have the limits that we used to a long time ago, right? So before, like 2 gig may have filled up a hard drive, where now not so much anymore. So those can be a little bit larger. And as long as you don't have, as long as you have somewhere that you're forwarding them to, you don't need to keep them on host for very long. So that's the normal standard.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think you need to look at how you're getting data off each of one of those hosts. If you're at a point where you're never taking data off that host, then it needs to be a pretty big log size, because you're going to have to go back and manually work that host. Or preferably you don't have to do that. It really, and the way that I tend to look at this is, how quickly are you going to get data off of that environment? And at the same time, what rate is it keeping up with in regard to how much data is coming out of that environment as well? So when it comes to Logmira, we obviously have some defined settings. When you run Poshum, for example, our tool that we have, if there's any event channels, and I know someone had asked what event channels we use, I'm going to link a JSON, or we'll get a link out for the JSON for how Poshum works, so you can kind of see the event channels that we tend to use. We will automatically turn on those channels and then set that to 125 megs as a default. And part of that is because we expect that data to come out of the platform well before it gets that 125 meg rate. Here at Blumira, we can tell you, because we know it takes about, from the moment of the event existing, about 60 to 120 seconds to get it up to us for us to do parsing and detection. So generally speaking, when you're thinking about that, well, 16.2 rows, 125 to doesn't need to be in the gigs. In a lot of cases, that data is well off the host if you're pulling that data out regularly in a stream, essentially, from those hosts. And it tends to work out just fine in those situations, generally speaking.
Great, thanks for all those tips, Matt.
And I know somebody asked the XML versus the format of NXLog. We like JSON. I don't, as an engineer, I'm never going to take XML if I can avoid getting XML. We also modify the format of NXLog's config to an extent, because we want the timestamps to be in millisecond, like full epoch millisecond, whereas we don't want it to just be like a timestamp. So that's another thing that we do inside of NXLog as that data flows through.
Awesome. So let's move on to the next event ID, and this one is more of an operations event ID rather than security. But Matt, I know that you have a lot of opinions about the intersection of security and operations. Do you want to tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah. So 52 runs across a bunch of different things, and the enablement of this really depends on drivers that exist on your host and how it's working. So it's worth going and gandering, especially at like the sub 120 event IDs. You can get some crazy information out of those, because it's where a lot of that OS kernel driver level stuff just gets jammed into the event viewer, which a lot of it is probably boring, but a lot of it is also quite interesting. And 52 with hard disk drive failures, I'm a big fan of. And if you use Blumira and you have a failing disk, you will get this alert because it's really important in my experience, especially. And I think any of us with sysadmin background know, like, I'd rather replace a disk when I know the smart drivers are unhappy about that disk because there's something wrong with it, and or run check disks on it, then wait until my user gets a hold of me and says, everything's dead and I can't work. So like, what am I supposed to do with this? And it lets you get ahead of a lot of those issues before they become big failure problems. Because those smart drivers are going to review, they're going to check for errors inside of segments as it's trying to do writes and reads. And it's going to tell you if there's something wrong with that machine. And it seems like, I think a lot of us as we use Windows expect it to just be useless in a lot of ways and not actually help us. But this is one of the ways that Windows and smart drives inside of it actually tell you, like, hey, I'm having trouble and you need to look at this soon. So this is, it seems like a weird one from a SIM security perspective, I know, but from an operational usefulness perspective and making your life easier as a sysadmin and running infrastructure, it's nice. I mean both. It's the smart drive. We had a question. I mean the drivers for the drives. It uses the smart drivers that are leveraging pulling data out of those drives specifically. So if you don't have smart drivers, you won't get this installed to this weekend.
Thanks for that, Matt. Seems like it would be a really useful thing to monitor.
It's good for laptops, especially. For sure.
Very cool. So I think this brings us to the last event IDs that we're going to talk about here today, 5155 and 5157. So this is Windows filtering, platform auditing, and GPO structure. So what does this give you visibility into? Amanda, you want to take this one?
Yeah, so this is around the configuration of Windows Firewall, which a lot of times, I don't know, what do you think, Matt? We probably see Windows Firewall be configured maybe 10-15% of the time.
A little more now than it used to be. So we, in the last couple of months, we did add a flag to Passion, so it'll do it all for you. So we're starting to see a little more now. But yeah, it's good 15-20%.
Yeah. So you can use this for port scanning and lateral movement and all of those kind of things that usually happen post compromise or in the recon stage of an attack, and it really helps, especially when you have flat networks. Because there's a lot of times you cannot necessarily rely on your firewall or switch traffic, and this will give you a lot of that visibility.
Yeah. To echo that, if you're in an environment that's flat and not yet segmented, which is, if you're in a legacy network that you haven't had a chance to tear the whole thing down and rebuild it, which is totally understandable.
Everywhere
for sure. Windows Firewall and Windows filtering, platform auditing, which is a mouthful, both get you the visibility that you would usually get at that like segmented firewall, where you can see, like, I can see someone is trying to get into my environment, report scan, or do internal recon across inside broadcasts, which can be really, really helpful. Even if you are segmented, if someone gets into that like /24 broadcast and they never leave it and they never go across anything, this allows you to get that level of visibility. You can see, well, I know that this single machine, which happened to be poked into my DMZ, is now scanning inside of broadcast. Why is this happening? And it gets you a lot of really nice visibility that usually you would be at that, like, let's find an endpoint agent that can detect that specific behavior when that specific thing is happening. And you can get this data directly out of Windows already, which is, it's really nice when you can get it set up and pull the data out for sure. And of course, the other two, the 515, we have a love-hate relationship with the entire 515 series of Windows Event IDs here. You're probably never going to want 5156, would be my guess, which is like basically network connections. If you do want that, use Windows Firewall, use Sysmon, don't use 5156 in a lot of cases. The issue with 5156, which is basically an allowed connection across the Windows filtering platform, is that it will take every single thing. So if you have a process that's making a call to localhost that happens to happen within that interface, it will log out tens of hundreds of millions of events a day, and it will eat everything. So
Yeah,
just
if you want that level of data, just do like log flow, like actual log flow data, because yeah.
And it's not helpful in most cases, is what we
No.
Windows Firewall will get you, and Sysmon will get you what you need in a lot of cases. You don't need 5156 in most cases, not always, but in most cases. And then 5155 is always great. That's about listening ports, them being blocked, and the same goes for 5157. So there are definitely useful event IDs inside of that Windows filtering platform GPO, but depending on your use cases, also look at Windows Firewall. It's pretty straightforward to pull data out of, annoying, but straightforward to pull data out of, as well as Sysmon for network connections.
All right, thanks, Matt. So now that we've talked about some of the most important event IDs you should monitor, let's talk about like how to use those to the fullest extent. And one of those best practices that we have on here is taking a high level approach. So not just looking at every single granular event ID that comes through, but looking at patterns in mass. Matt, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's single event IDs are useful for point in time things, like a domain admin being added is an event that works out great. It's specific. However, one of the areas is where you start to get into a more odd situation is that domain admin security enabled group edition. It's pretty straightforward detection to an extent. However, depending on how that actually goes across your environment, it may be a situation where the detection that is inherently in place may not trigger. Maybe they're looking for domain admin, but you created a new role in your security enabled groups. So it becomes really more about how are you using your infrastructure? How are you detecting things occurring within your infrastructure? And what are these things that are occurring within that kind of structure of your environment that are most important to you? And for us, and Amanda already alluded to this, it really depends on what we're looking for. If we're looking for password spraying, or we're looking for cred stuffing, we're going to be, and anyone who's looking for this is going to be looking across a large set of attempts and successes across from Kerberos and TLM, either one, to look to see what kind of behavior is coming out of that actual data. Is there a single client IP or a single source IP that's attempting to authenticate across a large number of users, either successful or not successful, hopefully not successful, within that certain time period? And in that case, you're looking at 4625, you're looking at Kerberos authentication, ticket request failures, and you're having to look at a variety of different pieces of information to put together that behavior and pattern within it. So it really varies in Windows around what's happening in your environment, how do you use your environment, and going back to Amanda's point about PowerShell, if you are encoding PowerShell, doing it in a better way so you can avoid and make sure that if an attacker comes in, you and the attacker are both not running encoded PowerShell and bypass, because it happens a bunch of different places, and it's important to think about how you're applying actions against your environment so they're coming out of the logs, and then you can detect on them in kind as well.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find the answer to the question.
Yeah, I figured you were. I'll go to the use this one part. Amanda's getting an answer for the question center. So
I'm finding you what we actually use for our detection. What event IDs? So just give me a second.
So for Sysmon, and you've obviously heard us talk a lot about this on here, and if you Google Boomera Sysmon, you're going to see us talk about it a lot as well. Sysmon is a free tool, is super good. The hardest, quote unquote, hardest part about Sysmon is making sure it's configured properly. You can't just install it and it will suddenly start working. I wish you could, that would be great. But it requires a very specific configuration to be loaded into it when the service is configured or installed. We do this as a part of our Poshum stuff, but for everyone's information, we use Sysmon Modular. It's on GitHub. Take a gander at it. It is really, really good at getting the information out of Sysmon that you're going to need, and also providing parity with what amounts to those network connections or the process creation with 4688 within that Sysmon environment. It also provides some nice benefits, like if someone, an attacker, downloads an exe to a specific folder and then deletes it, Sysmon will cache that deleted file for you so you can go back and get it. It provides you with some deep information on it. And yeah, there's a bunch of great webinars like the Black Hills one on Sysmon. It's a very, very good tool, and it's worth using if you have the bandwidth to get the data out of those environments and into a SIM or somewhere else for you to continue to review. It makes your Windows logging 10 times more powerful than anything it has. And if you're using an NGAV, it's still worth putting Sysmon into those environments. We can tell you from our own experience that we are able to get ahead of a lot of NGAVs in detection based off Sysmon data alone in most situations. She's still working, so I'm going to keep talking.
Right? There's several. There's several.
Yeah,
I'll keep talking. I found three already.
I'm going to keep talking. And of course, the last big one is centralizing your logs, of course. I mean, this is kind of, we've been talking about this throughout the entirety of this webinar, but when it comes to max log size, when it comes to getting data out, when it comes to the format of that data, when it comes to what you're actually pulling out, all of it kind of comes back to centralizing those logs. And the only way to get the most out of your logs is to do two things: pull them out and put them into a system where you can actually evaluate them in a structured manner. And what that really allows you to then do is perform that analysis on it, determine what needs to be changed or improved, and move forward with your organization. Because realistically, like, who wants to burn 4 gigs of local space to then go to that machine to then look at the thing? And even from a reporting perspective, and a lot of customers of Blumera use it in this way, for example, and I mentioned the MSI install previously. We have a number of customers that just say, like, I want a weekly report of every single MSI install across every single machine. And that kind of information, if you centralize your logs, becomes really useful, really powerful, and really straightforward to pull out of those environments and then reflect back into your operations and infrastructure teams. And that doesn't even get into the being able to actually identify patterns, being able to correlate across different types and event IDs, and being able to kind of stretch and run forward and do better.
Thanks, Matt. That brings
Thanks.
us to
I finished my my answer in chat. So
all right. Looks like we've got some good information in there. By the way, we've gotten a couple of questions about whether you all will receive a recording of this webinar. You will. And one question about the Q&A. I know there's been a lot of good nuggets of info in there. I'm not sure if that's something that we're going to be able to do, but hopefully we've been able to talk about it enough in the presentation where you can kind of get that information from listening to the recording. So with all that being said, centralizing the logs, Blumera is a great option for that. And we recently released a free edition of Blumera that detects on Microsoft 365. So in any Microsoft environment, you can easily connect to Microsoft 365 and get those logs flowing and get some security insight right away. Matt, do you want to talk a little bit about, what you can detect in Microsoft 365 and, how that's beneficial? Just a quick once over is probably good.
Sure. Yeah, I won't list off the 40 plus, I'm pretty sure now, things that we're detecting in 365. So 365 is, of course, I mean, I think we have like 93% of our customers use M365 is very, very common. And I imagine most of you also use 365. It is one of the most kind of prolific things out there, and really one of the most glaring ways that 365 gets exploited is through, and I know Amanda loves this detection, is through adding in forwarding rules inside of accounts. It is the most, well, it is the quickest way to identify breached accounts within the environment. So what we do with 365 data generally is we do a lot in detection when it pertains to identifying breached accounts, identifying potentially breached accounts like weak access and then passwords being leveraged, or ensuring that you get visibility into how people are leveraging 365. And that could range from people are downloading files off of your SharePoint or they are modifying how their accounts are actually functioning as it pertains to forwards, so on and so forth. The benefit, of course, you sign up for free, try it out, set it for 365. You get a big old list of all the stuff that gets played out for your detections. Same goes for beginning to look into that data as well and run global reports. So if you're really interested around like what the full list is, what you're going to get, please sign up. Please connect your 365, and we'll start detecting stuff. And you'll be able to run reports on it. And it'll be magical, and it'll be great for everyone.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
If you
how I'm
want
going to end that webinar, obviously, that it will be magical.
If you want to try that free edition, go to bluemirror.com/free. You don't have to sign up with a credit card or talk to a salesperson. You just get started, and it only takes a couple minutes. So really a win-win for everyone. All right, so I know we're coming to the end of the hour here. I really appreciate everyone's time that they've taken, whether it's your lunch break or any hour in your day. We really appreciate you taking the time to join our webinar and learn more about Windows Event IDs. We hope you found this really helpful. Feel free to keep an eye out for our future webinars, and thank you again for joining. Amanda and Matt, thank you so much for providing all of your insight. Gotten some great tips here today, so we really appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely.
All right.
Thank
Well,
you,
happy Thursday, everyone. Happy almost weekend, almost Friday. And I hope you have a great rest of the week, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.